Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C., where we are covering the McAleese Credit Suisse Conference, an annual gathering of heavy hitters here in Washington. And in that context, we are honored to have with us former Virginia Congressman and proud Democrat Jim Moran. Sir, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Vago. It always is.
You know, we just heard from Adam Smith, obviously the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. He had some great lines. He said when you get elected to Congress and you put the pin on, you don't get issued a magic wand. Any more than, and he basically termed the budgetary situation we face now is that we're still living in Fantasy Island. Obviously, you're not on the Hill anymore, but you still have a lot of friends up there. You're still very, very engaged. How do you look at the budgetary picture as it stands right now, particularly in regard to defense? There's going to be more money for defense, but how do you think the dynamics of this are going to play out?
Vago, this is highly problematic. In the first place, the president is going to come to a rude awakening that there are three equal branches of government. With his refugee ban, he realized there is a judiciary branch, and so far they've stopped him at what he's wanted to do in that arena. And now he's going to learn that there's a legislative branch, and they have their own priorities. And they've been working at this throughout their careers. The senior members are chairman and ranking members because they've spent so many years trying to work out whatever authorization appropriation bill it might be. And unfortunately, they realize that the president has a very thin team, and that thin team really doesn't have the experience that they need. So specifically with defense, you have to have a fiscal year 17 defense bill. It's got to be a regular bill, no continuing resolution. You can't continue to operate the same programs at the same funding level and think that you're providing adequate security to this country. And on April 28th, we fall off the cliff. There's no more funding. The problem is that while you need an increase, part of the increase requested was in the base bill. Now, I'm getting into the weeds a bit here, but there's a sequestration cap, and basically it keeps a $549 billion level. Now, we have busted through that cap, but only when the Republicans were willing to compromise with the Democrats and give an equal amount of funding for the non-defense discretionary programs. It's called parity. Well, he has said, instead of doing that, we're going to increase defense, for example, in $30 billion in 17 and $54 billion in FY18. We're going to take it all from non-defense. That's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. What has to happen is you've got to get rid of this stupid sequestration. I was there when we did it. It was basically a dare. If you don't work with us, this is the worst thing that's going to happen, and we're threatening with, and then all of a sudden it happened. No one wanted this sequestration. It's bad for the country. It's bad for the government. It's bad for everyone that depends upon federal programs, particularly the Defense Department. So to get rid of the sequester, it's not under reconciliation because it doesn't save money. It does just the opposite. You have to have 60 votes in the Senate at this point in time. There are no Democrats that will vote to increase defense at the expense of non-defense. They'll vote to increase defense, but not if you're going to take it from NIH and take it from every other human service program, as well as transportation.
And foreign aid as well, right? I mean, that's where the administration wants to make it up.
The administration wants to cut about 30% from foreign aid. Of course, the two largest recipients of foreign aid are Israel and Egypt. They're not going to cut that. The Congress isn't, and the president doesn't want to do that. Even EPA, which gets the biggest cut, 32%, most of EPA goes into water infrastructure. It's for safe drinking water systems and municipal sewer systems. It's a revolving fund. The president doesn't know that, but you can't cut those programs, and those are the major grant programs at EPA. So the president's going to come to a reality here that he's going to work with the Congress, and that the Congress knows, frankly, a lot more than he does. And, of course, he's got very thin ranks within each of the agencies in terms of people who he will listen to. So I think, to get to the bottom line here, I think we'll get a regular FY17 defense bill. It won't increase defense by as much as it should be increased, but we'll get it only because we have to. But beyond that, I don't think we'll get a fiscal year 18 bill. I think we're going to hit stalemate. And even with FY17, we're going to have some major problems in terms of funding the programs that need to be funded and doing it on time. So what he has to do, and again, the weeds, but to get through FY17, you have to put the increase in what's called OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations, because that's emergency funding. It doesn't fall under the sequestration caps. That's what OMB should have done, and then the Congress would have looked the other way, would have passed the full increase, and we would have been done with it. But the president put the wrong guy in charge of OMB. He put, well, he calls himself a deficit hawk, but he's an ideologue, and he put a lot of this in the base budget, which means that it has to break the sequestration caps, and you can't do that. So I'm afraid healthcare reform fails, tax reform as a result probably fails, and I think his initiatives that have to be funded, right now, he has no way through to winning that battle either.
Let me take you to two parts of this, right? So part number one of this is, obviously Mick Mulvaney, who is now the budget director, was part of the Freedom Caucus and was one of the guys who was comfortable with a debt default, which is one of the reasons we got the Budget Control Act in the first place, which was to avoid a debt default, right? The nightmare scenario as it was seen. As you look at and one thing that Mr. Smith said was the tax picture. I mean, he said, fundamentally, it's, we don't get there from here, especially if we cut taxes further. The second thing that he said, and I want to get your take on this, is that he would be much happier with a force of 400,000 that's trained, equipped, and ready, as opposed to go to a 600,000 person force, for example, a 600,000 person army, that's held together with duct tape. What do you think on both of those? Do we have anything that gets to tax reform that actually is revenue positive ultimately, which is a philosophical issue, but it's still rather untested if you cut taxes that much and whether or not you're going to get that sort of economic benefit. And the second thing is, do you think there are other members who have the same philosophy, even on the GOP side, who would be more comfortable with a smaller, better equipped force than a bigger, less equipped force? Because each one of the services at this point, the Marine Corps, the Army, and certainly the Air Force, are looking at expanding their ranks, as opposed to perhaps, on the equipment side of things.
Yeah. This is an excellent question. I'll try to handle all of it. You began by mentioning Mr. Mulvaney, the director of the whole Office of Management and Budget now. Why would you ever appoint someone who voted to default on a nation's debt as head of OMB? I mean, that's insane. We're not going to pay off our interest and principal on our treasury bills and notes and bonds. That's grossly irresponsible, and yet he's now in charge of OMB. Mistake number one. Mistake number two is to promise things that you don't know whether you can deliver. In fact, Mr. Trump, and I tend to be a fairly nonpartisan person, but Mr. Trump was elected by telling people what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to know. I'm not sure he needed to, that he knew what he needed to know, but he's rapidly going to find that out. In terms of the defense budget, General Mattis is correct. First, you have to fix the potholes. First, you have to make sure, in other words, that all of your troops are well-trained and well-equipped before you go adding more troops. And the same thing with all your ships and planes and tanks. You need to make sure that they're functioning well before you add more to the inventory. So General Mattis submitted a responsible budget. But I'm afraid that it's going to be very difficult to get through the legislative logistics to get that responsible budget funded, even in FY17. FY18 is extremely problematic. I really think we're going to be at a deadlock for FY18.
I know that you are a regular we're on the international conference circuit. You would talk to some of our allies and have those kind of interactions. Do you have any concerns about, obviously there's the Russian inquiry, we heard about that. And for those of you who are here, it's a giant conference and there's something on the screen there if you can hear some rumbling in the background. We're not in the lobby of a movie theater. What are some of the things that concern you in terms of some of the messaging? Obviously, Rex Tillerson is going to Russia instead of going to a NATO foreign ministers meeting. Now those foreign ministers are looking at rescheduling. Mr. Smith, but a number of others, including on the GOP side, John McCain, Lindsey Graham in particular, have sort of bristled at the America First language. They've both said that it's implicit America is always first, but you don't necessarily want to be saying that to some of our allies. Do you think that there's going to be a U.S. security implication in terms of our allies' willingness to cooperate with us that stems from some of this language and some of the decisions?
I think that there are already irreparable damages that have been suffered by the United States in terms of its prestige around the world. In Germany, for example, before the election, almost 60% of Germans felt that they could trust the United States to preserve the world for democracy and free enterprise, human rights, etc. Now it's down to 27%. It dropped by 50% at least. Angela Merkel is now being looked to for the leadership of liberal democracies. That doesn't mean leftist democracies. It means democracies where individual freedoms are prized. So there's been a lot of damage, and Asia figures this is their opportunity. China at least figures. So Japan is in a very different situation, and it's very concerned. I'll tell you that many of my European friends in Parliament and so on are using a sophisticated military term whose acronym is WTF at almost everything that Mr. Trump has been doing. They just are puzzled. They're mystified. How could this happen? Europe has relied upon the United States, if not as a co-equal partner, even as the leader that they could, that would give them cover to make the right decisions, the tough decisions. And that's no longer there. This kind of America First jingoism is nuts. If you feel that way, keep it to yourself. Because we desperately need our allies for intelligence, to be able to go to places in the world that we don't want to go, and to to be our eyes and ears, and frankly our commitment to the principles that we cherish. The European Union is in our interests, and unfortunately, Donald Trump doesn't recognize that.
Let me ask you one last question. Obviously, one of the challenges is questions of employment. There was a very disgruntled base in the United States, particularly in formerly heavy industrial areas, whether they were in the Rust Belt states, but elsewhere in the country, where folks feel there's a disparity in terms of wages, where there has been a lot of wage stagnation. We've seen that even in Washington. What are some of the proposals that Democrats can put on the table? Because the president's statements are driven by the interests of those who he feels voted for him. He's very committed. You got to give him credit. He's doing the things that he said, whether people judge them to be the right things or not. He has shown a commitment to try to do that. And the America First part of it is, I'm going to do whatever I can to put Americans back to work, even if it means not buying stuff from abroad and having sort of this negative view about globalization. What's the Democrat counterpoint to that?
Well, first of all, don't promise things that you can't deliver. Second of all, and it's just as in our own human lives, personal lives, if you want to make friends with people, if you want people to support you when you need them, you need to reach out to them. You need to know their name. You need to go to their communities. Democrats didn't do that. The Democrats thought that they could play identity politics, assuming that if you're a minority, if you're gay, if you're a single educated woman, et cetera, all those lists, then you were going to vote Democratic. And that was the East and the West Coast and the major cities. But they thought that they could get elected by ignore the Midwest, the Plain States, the South. And, that's part of America, too. And those folks realize, hey, these people don't care about us. We may not agree with Mr. Trump. We may not even like his personality, but at least he cares about us. At least he's going to see us. We don't have to pay $5,400 for a seat to listen to Hillary. So we played it very poorly. And we played it as though the Democratic Party is a 51% majority party. That's not who we are. It's not why I'm a Democrat. Bill Clinton reached out to everyone. And, we've talked before, and he will tell you, I always assumed that if people knew me, I'd get 2 out of 3 of those votes. And he played it right. She played it wrong.
Do you think, though, that in that context, there needs to be a broader debate on both wage equality, jobs, investment, worker retraining, and in that context, does an America First strategy potentially backfire in that case?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, the Democratic Party was wrong. Hillary particularly was wrong because she knew how important the Trans-Pacific Partnership is to America's long-term growth. Whatever party it is, in the long run, they need to be in favor of free trade. They need to reform entitlements because it's 2/3 of the budget, it'll be 3/4 of the budget. It's money that goes to people like me, and many of us don't need it, but we shouldn't be taking it from our kids. So you have to support entitlement reform, and Democrats won't touch it. The third thing is...
Especially because your selfish generation is just living longer, for God's sakes, and
we're
costing...
We're living too damn long, and then we don't want to die, and we spend most of our Medicare money in the last 6 months of life. Let's show some courage and say, look, life is over, let's die with dignity. But that's just my own view. But we need to be in favor of free trade. We need to be willing to reform entitlements. And thirdly, we have to embrace the military. The reality is that the military is the best way out of neighborhoods where there's nowhere else to go. The military provides discipline. It provides organizational structure. It provides the kind of dignity and mobility that people need all over the country, and it provides it in a way that doesn't discriminate. It's the world's greatest meritocracy. We should embrace the Defense Department instead of not ever wanting to vote for it. That's what we should do. And then the other thing we need to be aware of is that as many jobs as globalization and automation has taken, artificial intelligence and robotics is going to take far more. We need to figure out a way to give people a sense of dignity. In the long run, we're probably going to have to reduce the number of hours of work per week, maybe even the number of days, I don't know. But we need more people to be part of our economy. We can't leave them by the wayside. And just at least to consider them, to care about them is the first step. And then it's not just about a debate. It's about actual policies that are going to let them live lives of greater dignity and hope in the future.
Former Congressman Jim Moran, thanks very much, sir. Always appreciate it.
Thank you, Vago. My pleasure.